the three. The cold wind rolled across the barren fields of southern Italy as a convoy of exhausted women, Italian prisoners of war, were marched toward a temporary American encampment set up along the old gravel road outside Naples. The war had torn everything apart. Cities were burning ruins, farms were stripped bare, families scattered. Hunger had become a constant companion, sitting on every shoulder like a silent ghost. These women, once ordinary civilians pressed into auxiliary military labor, now walked with hollow faces, cracked lips, and bodies shivering under thin, dust-covered uniforms. The air carried the smell of burnt rubber, diesel engines, and distant smoke drifting from a town shelled days earlier. Every step they took felt heavier than the last. Their stomachs cramped with hunger, their throats raw from dehydration. They had survived on scraps, old bread, potato skins, watery soup, whatever their captors or circumstances allowed. But today, their fate had shifted, though they didn't know it yet. Ahead of them, American soldiers stood waiting. Their expressions were not hard or hateful. Instead, they looked curious, cautious, a little surprised at the sight of these frail women shuffling forward. For the first time in weeks, the atmosphere was not hostile. It was unfamiliar, and somewhere within that unfamiliarity was the strange possibility of kindness. Metal pots clanged. A breeze swept through the camp, carrying with it something impossibly foreign to the starving women, the smell of warm food. The scent hit them like a wave, and everything stopped. Faces lifted, eyes widened, hands trembled. For a brief, fragile moment, hunger was replaced by disbelief. The moment the American soldiers lifted the metal lids of the field kitchen, everything changed. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. The steam that escaped didn't just rise into the chill Italian air, it drifted toward the women like a living thing, carrying with it the rich smell of beans, meat, and cooked vegetables. For the starving Italian POW women, that scent struck deeper than any bullet or explosion they had ever heard. Hunger had stripped them down to instinct, but something about this moment, this smell, felt almost unreal, like the memory of a dream they thought they had forgotten. They stood frozen for several seconds, uncertain whether they were even allowed to move closer. In the weeks leading up to this day, food had been nothing more than a fading rumor. Their captors before had given them scraps, rancid bread, cloudy water, occasional boiled potato skins that barely counted as nourishment. Hunger wasn't just a physical ache anymore, it had become part of their identity. Their bodies had adapted to constant emptiness, their minds dulled into a half-conscious fog. They had forgotten what real steam smelled like, what warm food could feel like as it touched the air. One of the younger women, barely in her 20s, blinked several times as if trying to wake herself up. Her cheekbones were sharp, her lips cracked, her hair matted to her forehead. She took a tiny step forward, then stopped, startled by her own movement. Her boots were worn thin, almost hollow at the soles, but she forced herself to lean closer when the steam touched her face. Another woman behind her whispered a warning, not because she feared the Americans would hurt them, but because she could not believe kindness would come so easily, especially from the other side of a war. The soldiers, most of them barely older than the women, exchanged glances. None of them had expected this convoy to look so frail. They had been told Italian auxiliaries were coming through. Prisoners, yes, but not frontline soldiers, not combatants hardened by the brutality of the battlefield. Still, what they saw now unsettled them. The women looked more like survivors of a famine than prisoners of war. Their uniforms hung like oversized cloth on their thinning frames, buttonholes stretched, fabric stained from dirt and sweat and weeks of sleepless travel. One soldier, a tall man from Kansas with sandy hair, poking out from under his helmet, swallowed hard. His name tag read Miller, and he had been in Italy for months, but he had never seen suffering quite like this. He reached for the ladle with a kind of reverence, dipping it into the thick stew, as though being careful not to disturb the ingredients. He motioned for the nearest woman to come forward. She hesitated. Her instinct was to look for permission. Permission she had spent months being denied. It was not the soldier's gesture that frightened her. It was the idea that this was somehow a trick, that the food might be snatched away once she moved closer. Hunger had taught her suspicion. Survival had taught her caution. But the steam kept drifting. The smell kept pulling. And at last, with trembling legs, she stepped forward. As Miller poured the stew into her metal cup, a small puff of heat rose up and bathed her face. Her breath caught. Her fingers, pale and stiff from cold, reached out slowly to grasp the cup. For a moment, she didn't even raise it. She simply pressed her hands around the warm metal, drawing heat into her bones. Her shoulders lifted slightly, almost a flinch, when the warmth spread, as though her body didn't know how to process comfort after so long. Behind her, another woman choked on a quiet sob. She covered her mouth instantly, ashamed. The sound seemed too personal, too vulnerable to reveal in front of strangers. Yet the emotion was impossible to contain. Tears slipped down her cheeks, leaving thin, muddy lines through the dust that coated her skin. She stared into the pot as though she were staring into another world. Several soldiers noticed this. Their expressions softened. They weren't used to seeing enemy prisoners this close, let alone women, let alone starving women. War had taught them to dehumanize threats, to stay guarded, to stay alert. But in this moment, the battlefield felt impossibly distant, replaced by something simpler and painfully human. Miller crouched slightly, trying to meet the crying woman's eyes, but she quickly looked away, not out of fear, out of embarrassment. Hunger had taken so much from her that even accepting food now felt like a weakness she didn't want anyone to witness. She wiped her cheek with the back of her wrist, pretending the tear never happened. Another ladle dipped. Another bowl filled. Another trembling hand reached out. Some women could barely lift their arms. Their muscles had been too deprived for too long. Their fingers curled slowly, like those of someone waking up from a long, harsh winter. When the soldiers noticed this, they began placing the bowls directly into their hands with extra care, speaking softly but not pitying them, just guiding them. The smell of cooked vegetables spread wider through the camp. The mix of beans and meat simmering in broth filled the air with a heaviness that made several women sway on their feet. Some instinctively inhaled deeply, letting the scent settle deep in their lungs. A woman with grey, streaked hair pressed her hands together in a silent prayer before even touching the food. Whether she thanked God, fate, or the soldiers didn't matter. It was gratitude in its purest form, born from desperation. One soldier, noticing the way their uniforms clung to their bony shoulders, whispered to another, "Jesus, they look half dead." The other soldier nodded, jaw tight. "We gotta feed them slow," he said quietly. "They've been starving. Can't shock their system." But the women didn't know that. Their hunger was beyond patience. Their bodies longed to consume every ounce of heat and nourishment in front of them. Yet even in their desperation, they tried to remain composed. Some raised the cups to their lips only to stop again, hesitating, savoring the moment before tasting the first real food in what felt like an eternity. One young woman, no older than 19, clutched her cup to her chest like it was sacred. Her eyes were glassy, not with tears, but with disbelief. She scanned each soldier's face, trying to understand why her captors, her supposed enemies, would offer so much, so freely. Her world view had been shaped by propaganda, fear and survival. But now, warmth seeped through her chest, fighting against everything she had been taught. Another woman pressed her fingers against the rim of her cup, letting the heat warm her fingertips. She rubbed her thumb against the metal, feeling the smoothness, the reality of it. This wasn't a hallucination. This wasn't a cruel joke. The Americans were feeding them generously. Behind the serving line, soldiers began gesturing for the women to spread out, to give space, to sit if they could. A few found wooden crates to rest on. Others sank to the ground, legs buckling from exhaustion. Some didn't sit at all. They just stood perfectly still, holding their cups like lifelines. For the first time in weeks, an emotion flickered on their faces that had nothing to do with fear or despair. It was hope. Fragile, thin, almost trembling, but unmistakable. The camp, once a place of orderly military structure, now looked like a sanctuary. Steam from the pots curled upward into the grey air, like ghosts escaping a long confinement. The women's breaths mingled with the heat, creating small puffs that rose and dissolved. Soldiers moved among them slowly, carefully, as though trying not to startle wounded birds. No one spoke loudly. There was no shouting, no barking orders. Only the soft clatter of metal cups, the quiet shifting of feet, the distant rumble of vehicles, and the gentle murmur of soldiers offering reassurance through simple actions. Steady hands, careful ladling, patient gestures. The moment felt strangely suspended, as though the war had paused for a heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, something extraordinary happened. The starving Italian women felt human again. Their world, filled with fear, hunger, and uncertainty, had shifted, even if only for an afternoon. The warmth of the stew seeped into their hands, into their chests, into their spirits, thawing the cold despair that had long been lodged inside them. And as steam drifted upward, carrying the smell of food and the faint touch of hope, the first fragile threads of trust began weaving themselves into the fabric of a war-torn world. The first spoonful rose slowly, almost painfully slow, as though the starving woman feared that any sudden movement might break the fragile reality she had stepped into. Her hand trembled violently, not only from hunger but from disbelief. The metal cup was warm against her palms, far warmer than her own skin, and for a moment she simply held it there, letting the heat seep into her bones. She looked down into the stew, watching the thin veil of steam rise in soft waves. Beans, bits of meat, small chunks of carrots and potatoes floated in a thick broth, and for a brief moment she wondered if she had forgotten how real food was supposed to look. The scent alone felt heavy enough to make her dizzy. Slowly, she lifted the spoon to her lips. The warmth brushed her mouth first, and then her tongue, and she stopped. Her eyes fluttered closed as the flavor spread inside her. Simple, earthy, nourishing, completely unlike the tasteless scraps she had been fed in the past weeks. She swallowed, and her throat tightened, not just from the heat, but from emotion. She opened her eyes again just to make sure the food was still there. It was. She took another small bite, this one faster, desperate. Almost panicked, as though she feared someone might suddenly snatch the bowl away. Around her, Other women were experiencing similar moments. Some stared into their cups before eating, whispering prayers as their thin fingers curled around the warm metal. Others ate mechanically, their jaws moving with a kind of frantic rhythm, trying to balance hunger with caution. A few couldn't stop tears from running down their faces as they tasted real nourishment for the first time in months. Their bodies shook, not from cold this time, but from sheer relief. A woman with sunken cheeks and tangled black hair sat on a wooden crate nearby. She lifted her stew to her nose and inhaled deeply, savoring the smell before taking a sip. The warmth hit her like a shock to the system. She closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging as though a heavy weight had just fallen off them. When she finally swallowed, her lips parted in a silent gasp. She looked up at the American soldier watching her, and for a moment their eyes met. Her expression was a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Why were the enemy offering her such kindness? The soldier quickly looked away, overwhelmed by the rawness of her stare. Another woman, older than most, with streaks of grey in her hair, ate more slowly. She had seen enough suffering to know that rushing food after starvation could hurt more than help. She took small, careful spoonfuls, pausing between each one to let her body accept it. Her hands shook so much that the spoon clicked against the cup, but her eyes remained steady, fixed on the stew as though it were the only anchor left in her collapsing world. Not far away, a young American soldier with freckles across his nose watched a group of women huddled together on the ground. They ate in silence, some leaning against each other for support. He had seen wounded soldiers before, had seen the horrors of combat, but nothing had prepared him for this. These weren't fighters. They weren't armed. They weren't a threat. They were just women, starving, exhausted, and clinging to survival with every spoonful they raised. Jesus, he murmured under his breath. Their skin and bones. His companion nodded, adjusting the sleeves of his uniform. War does that, he said quietly. But this is worse. Another soldier approached carrying a freshly baked loaf of bread, smuggled from the camp's main kitchen. He broke it into smaller pieces, pretending they were rations that had simply been overlooked in inventory. He handed a hunk to the nearest woman, who stared at it as though it were a sacred object. Her fingers brushed the soft crust, and she hesitated before lifting it to her lips. When she finally bit into it, her breath hitched. Bread, real bread. She chewed slowly, tears filling her eyes. She blinked rapidly, struggling to maintain composure, but the soldier could see how close she was to collapsing into gratitude. One motherly looking woman with tired eyes and a scarf wrapped around her neck noticed a younger girl struggling to hold her cup. The girl's hands shook so violently that broth spilled over the edge. Without a word, the older woman reached over and steadied the cup, her touch gentle but firm. Together, they lifted it to the girl's mouth, guiding her movements like a parent feeding a child. The girl swallowed quickly, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Her lips quivered as she whispered a faint, "Grazy," her voice barely audible. Nearby, a soldier shrugged off his jacket and gently placed it over the shoulders of a woman whose teeth were chattering uncontrollably. She flinched at first, startled by the unexpected warmth, but when she saw the soldier's cautious expression, she relaxed. She nodded gratefully and tightened the jacket around herself. The fabric smelled like sweat, gun oil, and earth, but to her, it felt like the softest blanket she had ever worn. Warmth, real warmth, wrapped around her chest, and she inhaled deeply, as though absorbing the kindness into her lungs. The atmosphere shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly. The initial tension, the fear, the suspicion, the disbelief, began to soften. The women no longer held their bowls like fragile treasures they might lose at any moment. Their shoulders relaxed, their breathing eased. The color, faint as it was, began to return to their cheeks. Their eyes, once clouded with exhaustion, now shimmered with fragile clarity. The American soldiers didn't speak much. They moved carefully among the women, adjusting blankets, offering extra broth, refilling cups. Their footsteps were gentle, their gestures slow and intentional. It was as though they had collectively understood that this moment was too delicate to disrupt with unnecessary noise. One soldier knelt beside a woman who was coughing after swallowing too quickly. He placed a hand on her back, rubbing gently until her breathing steadied. She looked at him with wide, frightened eyes, not used to such direct compassion from anyone, let alone an enemy uniform. He offered her the canteen, and she drank small sips of water, her fingers brushing his briefly. He felt the coldness of her skin, cold not from weather, but from starvation. Another woman finished her cup and stared into it, almost confused that it was empty. A soldier noticed her hesitation and quietly refilled it, setting it in her lap with a respectful nod. She whispered something in Italian, soft, broken, sincere. The soldier couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Gratitude needed no translation. The soundscape of the camp was changing too. Instead of groans of hunger or murmurs of fear, there were now soft breaths of relief, quiet sips, gentle muttering as women tried to steady themselves. The crackling of the field stove blended with the soft clatter of metal cups and spoons. A sense of calm, unfamiliar but desperately needed, began to settle over them. One woman, sitting cross-legged in the dirt, held her cup with both hands and stared at the stew for a long time without eating. A soldier noticed and approached cautiously. He knelt beside her and asked if she was all right. She looked up, her eyes hollow and red-rimmed. I thought I would never taste warm food again," she whispered. He didn't know how to respond. Instead, he placed a hand over his heart and nodded, acknowledging her suffering in the only way he knew how. Gradually, as the women filled their stomachs for the first time in what felt like forever, their breathing deepened, their gazes grew steadier, and their trembling began to slow. Warmth spread through their bodies from the inside out, thawing the numbness that had become part of their very existence. Some of them looked around the camp for the first time, noticing details they had been too weak to see earlier: the tents, the equipment, the soldiers' wary faces. And in those faces, they saw not cruelty, not hatred, but empathy. Real human empathy. A soldier leaned against a supply crate, arms folded, watching the women eat. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes softened as he saw them recover piece by piece. Another soldier stood beside the field stove, stirring the pot to prevent it from sticking, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds to make sure no one's cup stayed empty for long. The camp was still cold. The sky was still gray. The war was still raging somewhere beyond the hills. But here, right here, something different was happening. Not victory, not surrender, not strategy or combat or politics. Something far more rare in wartime humanity. The starving women were no longer prisoners in this moment. They were no longer representatives of an enemy nation. They were simply exhausted human beings, rediscovering life one spoonful at a time. And as steam rose into the bleak Italian sky, as warmth returned to their bodies, As the soldiers moved among them with quiet care, a fragile bond formed, one built not on allegiance or ideology, but on the universal language of compassion. The women ate, the soldiers served, and the war, for just a moment, felt very far away. The shift was subtle at first, so subtle that most of the women didn't even realize it was happening. Their bodies were still weak, their hands still trembling, their breathing still shallow. But once the initial shock of receiving food faded, once the warmth settled deeper in their chests and the trembling in their fingers softened, something inside them began to stir. Gratitude, raw, fragile, overwhelming, slowly surfaced like a long, buried ember catching its first breath of oxygen. One of the Italian women, her cheek still streaked with dried tears, set her empty cup down and wiped her face with the back of her sleeve. The stew had warmed her stomach, but it was the unfamiliar gentleness of the American soldiers that warmed something deeper. She glanced around, watching the men move through the camp, adjusting blankets, offering canteens of water, handing out extra bits of bread when they thought no one was looking. And in that simple, quiet care, the world she thought she understood began to tilt. Her gaze fell on one soldier standing a few feet away, a young man with a tired face, dark circles under his eyes, and a solemn calmness about him. She swallowed and forced herself to approach. Her legs wobbled beneath her as she walked, but she stopped just short of him, clasping her hands nervously in front of her. To him she was just another prisoner, another starving soul rescued from the devastation of war. To her, he was something else entirely. A reminder that the enemy was not always the monster she had been told to fear. She lowered her head respectfully and whispered a soft, "Grazie." It was a simple word, but the weight behind it carried months of suffering, fear, and longing for kindness. The soldier blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected interaction, not like this. He nodded slowly, unsure what to say in return. But the woman wasn't asking for words. She was offering something deeper: acknowledgement. Nearby, another woman, older, with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, carefully reached inside her tattered uniform. Her fingers moved slowly, almost cautiously, as though retrieving something fragile. She pulled out a small, worn fabric charm, a tiny embroidered cross, the threads faded from time and hardship. It was the only possession she had managed to keep through months of captivity, the only piece of her past life she still held on to. She approached a soldier who had refilled her cup earlier, her steps measured and purposeful. The soldier saw her coming and stood up straighter, concerned she might need help. But instead she opened her palm and extended the charm toward him. He stared at it, confused, unsure what was being asked of him. She didn't speak, but her eyes conveyed everything. It was not payment, nor was it surrender. It was gratitude, given in the only way she could. A token of humanity offered in the middle of a war determined to strip it away. The soldier hesitated. He looked at her, then at the charm, then back again. He didn't want to take the last thing she owned. But she gently lifted his hand and placed the charm in his palm. Her fingers lingered for a moment, pressing lightly, urging him to accept. He finally nodded, slipping the charm carefully into his pocket with the kind of respect usually reserved for sacred things. She exhaled softly, relief washing over her face. For the first time in months, someone had accepted something from her. Not taken, not demanded, but accepted. It made her feel human again. As the sun began to set behind the hills, the camp transformed. The earlier coldness softened into a dusky calm. Lanterns were lit. casting warm halos of light that flickered against the canvas of tents and glowed softly on the faces of the tired women. Soldiers moved among them with blankets, guiding them toward the resting area set up near the large supply tent. The women followed hesitantly, unsure if they were allowed to rest, unsure if such generosity could really be trusted. But hunger had been replaced by warmth, fear by cautious hope, and the pull of rest was too strong to resist. Several women lowered themselves onto bedrolls arranged on the ground. Their bodies were still shaking, some from exhaustion, others from the emotional weight of the day. A few tried to sit upright, maintaining the formal posture expected of prisoners, but the soldiers insisted they lie down. "It's all right," one soldier said gently. "Rest. You're safe here. Safe." The word sounded foreign, almost dangerous in its softness. These women had lived weeks, months, trusting no one, fearing everything, clinging to survival through sheer will. Now, to be told they were safe by the very soldiers they had been told to fear, it was almost too much to comprehend. One young woman lay down fully, pulling a U.S. Army blanket around her shoulders. The rough wool scratched her skin, but the warmth it offered was so comforting she barely noticed. She curled onto her side and closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to savor the moment. She listened to the quiet hum of the camp, the crackle of lanterns, the distant murmurs of soldiers speaking softly, the rustle of tents in the evening breeze. For the first time in months, she realized she could breathe without her chest tightening in fear. Another woman sat cross-legged, chewing the last piece of bread she had saved. She ate slowly, not out of necessity, but out of reluctance to let the moment end. Whenever her gaze drifted to the soldiers, her eyes softened. These were not the cruel faces she had imagined from stories passed around back home. They were tired young men, boys, really, who seemed just as worn by war as she was. A soldier approached, holding a spare canteen. He paused before handing it over, unsure if she would accept it. She did, gently, gratefully, her fingers brushing his as she took it. She lifted it to her lips, drinking deep gulps of fresh water. It felt like life being poured back into her. When she finished, she whispered a thank you in Italian, her voice filled with genuine appreciation. He nodded, offering a small smile before stepping away. Across the camp, several women were settling under their blankets. One woman began humming softly, a melody from home, something familiar and comforting. The tune drifted through the air, soft and fragile, and the other women listened quietly. One or two even joined in, their voices weak but steady. The gentle lullaby rose into the twilight like a ghost from another world. The soldiers paused to listen. Some leaned on crates or sat on overturned buckets, staring at the fire or the sky as the women's voices floated gently around them. It was surreal, beautiful, tragic, impossibly human. It reminded them that these women had lives before the war, lives filled with families, routines, dreams. It reminded them that the enemy was often just another victim, another casualty of decisions made far above their heads. As the sky darkened fully, the camp settled into a rare quiet. The women lay in small groups, some whispering quietly to each other, others already drifting into exhausted sleep. The lanterns cast warm, golden light across their faces, softening the sharp edges of starvation and fear. A soldier stood watching them, arms crossed loosely over his chest. He wasn't guarding them, at least not in the usual sense. He was watching over them, making sure they were warm, safe, unharmed. When a woman shifted in her sleep and her blanket fell away, he stepped forward and gently pulled it back over her shoulders. Not far away, another soldier pulled the fabric charm from his pocket. He held it between his fingers, staring at it with a mixture of awe and sadness. To him it was just a tiny cross, but to the woman who had given it, it had been hope, her last reminder of life before war. Now it was a symbol of trust. Trust in him, trust in mercy, trust in the idea that even in war, humanity wasn't completely lost. He swallowed hard, closing his hand around the charm, before slipping it safely back into his pocket. By now the campfire was burning low, the flames reflecting in the eyes of both prisoners and soldiers. Despite everything happening beyond the camp, the battles, the shelling, the destruction, this small pocket of earth had become a sanctuary, a momentary ceasefire, a pause in the endless violence. One soldier said quietly to another, "Funny how the worst things bring out the best in people." The other nodded, staring into the fire. "Or maybe the best was always there," he said softly. "Ma just buries it." The night deepened. The temperature dropped, but for the first time in months, the women were warm, inside and out. Their stomachs were full, their spirits were lighter, their hearts were steadier, and the fear that had gripped them for so long finally loosened its hold. They slept, deeply, peacefully, almost desperately, wrapped in blankets that belonged to their enemies, warmed by food served by men they had been told to fear. Yet these same men had shown them kindness in its purest form. It wasn't grand. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't political. It was simply human. And in the fragile quiet of that night, beneath the lantern glow and the soft sounds of breathing, a truth settled gently over the camp. Sometimes humanity survives even where war tries hardest to destroy it.